When widower Marcus Kane bid on a woman labeled "too damaged" at a 1867 Kansas auction, he wasn't looking for love. He was looking for someone who understood the weight of surviving when everything you've built crumbles to dust. As federal marshals close in and her deadly secret threatens to destroy the fragile sanctuary they've created together, one question remains. Can two broken souls forge something strong enough to withstand the reckoning that's coming for them both? The railroad whistle screamed across the Kansas plains like a dying animal, cutting through the thick summer air of 1867. Marcus Kane jerked awake from another nightmare about his wife's empty grave, sweat dripping down his face despite the morning chill. The train had stopped at Clearwater Station, and through his window, he could see a crowd gathering around the wooden platform where the weekly auction was about to begin. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes and stepped off the train, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a hollow thud. He had come to town to buy supplies, not to watch people sell their belongings like they were nothing more than old furniture. But something about the hushed voices and pointing fingers made him curious enough to walk closer. The auctioneer stood on a makeshift stage made of wooden boxes, his voice booming across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have livestock, farming tools, and household goods up for bid today." The man's smile was too wide, too eager, like a snake showing its teeth before striking. Marcus pushed through the crowd, ignoring the stares from townspeople who whispered about the crazy widower who talked to ghosts. His own farm had been falling apart since Sarah died 6 months ago. The corn was half dead, the barn roof leaked, and he could barely remember to feed himself most days. Coming to town felt like stepping into a world that had kept spinning while his own had stopped completely. Near the front of the crowd, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach turn. A young woman sat on a wooden crate, her head down and her long red hair covering most of her face. Around her neck hung a piece of cardboard with words, written in black paint, "Woman, Lot 6, too damaged." The sight hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had seen plenty of awful things during his years as a cattle driver, but this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that made his hands shake with anger. The woman couldn't be more than 20 years old, and she sat so still she might have been carved from stone. An older man in a fancy suit leaned over to his friend and laughed. "Who would want to buy damaged goods like that? She's probably crazy or worse." His words carried across the crowd, and Marcus saw the woman's shoulders tense up like she was trying to disappear into herself. That's when Marcus noticed her hands. They were small and delicate, but covered in healing cuts and bruises that told a story he didn't want to imagine. Her dress was clean but patched in several places, and her shoes were worn down to almost nothing. She looked like someone who had been fighting a war and losing. The auctioneer's voice got louder as he pointed to different items. "We'll start with the farming equipment, then move on to the household goods, and finish with the special items." The way he said "special items" while looking at the woman made Marcus's jaw clench so hard his teeth hurt. A memory flashed through Marcus's mind, Sarah laughing as she hung laundry on the line, telling him about the new family that had moved in down the road. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over," she had said, her blue eyes sparkling with the kind of hope that Marcus thought had died with her. The auction continued around him, but Marcus couldn't take his eyes off the woman on the crate. She reminded him of a wild animal that had been trapped for too long, ready to run or fight, but too tired to do either. There was something about the way she held herself that spoke to the broken part of his own heart. When a young boy ran past chasing a chicken, the woman looked up for just a moment. Marcus caught a glimpse of her face and felt like he'd been struck by lightning. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held the same empty pain that Marcus saw in his own mirror every morning. She looked like someone who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. The crowd around them grew louder and more excited as valuable items went up for sale. A plow sold for $30, a set of china for $25, and a saddle for $40. But Marcus barely heard any of it. All he could think about was the woman with the sign around her neck and the terrible loneliness that seemed to pour off her like heat from a fire. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, sweat began to run down Marcus's back. The platform felt like it was getting smaller and smaller, pressing all the people closer together. The smell of dust and unwashed bodies mixed with the sweet scent of prairie grass in the distance. Somewhere a baby was crying, and horses stamped their feet impatiently in the heat. Marcus found himself thinking about his empty cabin and the silence that filled every room like thick fog. He thought about the chair where Sarah used to sit and sew, now covered with dust. He thought about the garden she had planted, now choked with weeds because he couldn't bring himself to tend it. Maybe two broken people could help each other find a way to keep living. The auctioneer was getting closer to the end of his list, and Marcus could see the woman's hands starting to shake. Whatever was about to happen, she was scared, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt something other than his own pain. He felt the need to protect someone else. The auctioneer's hammer hit the wooden podium 3 times, each bang echoing across the platform like gunshots. "Now we come to our final item of the day," he announced, his voice carrying a tone that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Lot number 6, one female, approximately 20 years of age." The woman's head snapped up at the sound of her own sale beginning, and Marcus saw terror flash across her face like lightning across a dark sky. Her green eyes darted around the crowd like a trapped rabbit looking for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The wooden crate beneath her might as well have been a prison. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks," the auctioneer continued, mopping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "She comes with some problems. Previous owner said she's got a temper and doesn't follow orders well, but she can cook, clean, and sew, so she's not completely worthless." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. The way the man talked about her like she was a broken tool instead of a human being made his blood boil. Around him, other men were nodding and whispering to each other, sizing her up like they were buying a horse. "What am I bid for this lot?" the auctioneer called out. "Remember, all sales are final. No returns accepted." A fat man in overalls raised his hand. $5, he shouted, and several people in the crowd laughed. The woman's face turned red with shame, and she looked down at her feet again. $5? The auctioneer shook his head. "Come now, gentlemen. Surely she's worth more than the price of a chicken. Look at those hands. She's clearly a hard worker." An old rancher near the front spoke up. $10, but only if she comes with a guarantee she won't run off. More laughter rippled through the crowd, and Marcus saw the woman's shoulders shake. He couldn't tell if she was crying or trying not to scream. Marcus stepped forward without really thinking about it. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and his mouth felt dry as dust. $25, he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The entire crowd turned to stare at him, and Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not since Sarah's death had made him the subject of so much gossip and pity. But something about the woman's desperate situation had awakened a part of him that he thought was dead. Well, the auctioneer grinned, sensing the possibility of a real bidding war. Marcus Kane enters the competition. $25 from the widower. Do I hear 30? The fat man in overalls looked Marcus up and down, then shrugged. $30. But I still want to know what's wrong with her first. Marcus's jaw tightened. $40, he said louder, his voice growing stronger with each word. He could feel the woman's eyes on him now, and when he glanced her way, he saw confusion mixed with the fear. She was trying to figure out why a stranger would fight for her. The bidding continued to climb, but Marcus kept raising his offer. $50, $60, $70. Each time he spoke, his voice became more determined. The other bidders began to drop out one by one, shaking their heads at the crazy man who was paying so much for damaged goods. At $75, the crowd fell silent. That was more money than most people in town made in 3 months. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for another bid, but no one was willing to go higher. The fat man in overalls spat in the dirt and walked away, muttering about fools and their money. Sold. The auctioneer's hammer came down with finality. Lot number 6 goes to Marcus Kane for $75. As the crowd began to break up, Marcus walked toward the wooden crate where the woman still sat. Up close, he could see that she was even younger than he had thought, maybe 19 at most. Her red hair was tangled and needed washing, but it caught the sunlight like copper wire. The bruises on her arms were fading from purple to yellow, which meant they were at least a week old. "What's your name?" Marcus asked quietly, trying not to startle her. She looked up at him with those storm cloud eyes, and he could see her trying to decide whether to trust him or run. "Catherine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Catherine Walsh." Marcus nodded and offered her his hand to help her stand. "I'm Marcus Kane. I have a farm about 15 miles north of here." He paused, not sure how to explain what he was thinking. "You can stay as long as you need to. No strings attached." Catherine stared at his outstretched hand like it might bite her. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Marcus thought about all the easy answers he could give, that he needed help around the farm, that he felt sorry for her, that it was the Christian thing to do. But looking into her eyes, he knew she would see through any lie, so he told her the truth. "Because I know what it's like to feel like the world has given up on you," he said simply. "And maybe we can help each other figure out how to keep going." For a long moment, Catherine studied his face like she was reading a book written in a foreign language. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold despite the heat of the day, and they trembled slightly as he helped her to her feet. The auctioneer appeared beside them with a piece of paper and a greedy smile. "That'll be $75, Mr. Kane. Cash only, as always." Marcus pulled out his worn leather wallet and counted out the money, almost everything he had saved for winter supplies. As he handed over the bills, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But when he looked at Catherine standing beside him, clutching a small bundle that seemed to contain everything she owned, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The wagon will hit another deep rut in the dirt road, jolting Catherine so hard she nearly fell off the wooden seat. She gripped the side rail with white knuckles, her small bundle of belongings bouncing in her lap as Marcus guided his two horses through the rough terrain of the Kansas prairie. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving Clearwater Station an hour ago. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap at any moment. Catherine kept stealing glances at the man who had bought her, trying to figure out what he really wanted. In her experience, men who spent that kind of money always expected something in return. Marcus looked different away from the auction crowd. His brown hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of someone who had seen too much sadness. His hands on the reins were steady and gentle, the same way he had helped her down from the platform. But Catherine had learned not to trust gentle hands. They could turn cruel faster than a summer storm. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, covered with tall grass that swayed in the hot breeze like ocean waves. In the distance, she could see a hawk circling high above, hunting for prey that had nowhere to hide in this vast openness. Catherine understood how that prey felt. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the creaking wheels and jingling harness. "About 2 hours," Marcus replied without taking his eyes off the road. "We'll follow this trail until it meets up with Willow Creek, then head east toward my property." Catherine nodded and went back to studying the landscape. She had never been this far from town before, and the emptiness was both frightening and somehow peaceful. There were no crowds of people staring at her, no whispered comments about her past, just endless sky and grassland that didn't care about her mistakes. As they traveled, Marcus found himself thinking about what he was going to do with Catherine once they reached his farm. The honest truth was that he hadn't planned beyond getting her away from that awful auction. His cabin only had 2 rooms, the main living area with the kitchen and fireplace, and his bedroom in the back. There was a small storage room, but it was barely big enough for one person and had no window. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to soak through Marcus's shirt. Beside him, Catherine had grown very still, her breathing shallow and quick. When he glanced over, he saw that her face had gone pale despite the heat. "Are you feeling sick?" he asked, pulling the horses to a slower pace. Catherine shook her head quickly, but her hands were trembling. "I'm fine," she lied, though her voice sounded shaky and weak. Marcus studied her more carefully. She was sitting rigid as a board, her eyes darting around like she expected danger to appear from the tall grass. He recognized the signs. He had seen the same thing in horses that had been badly treated. They never quite learned to relax even when they were safe. "There's a stream up ahead," Marcus said gently. "We can stop and rest the horses, maybe eat something." Catherine's reaction surprised him. Instead of relief, fear flashed across her face. "No," she said quickly. "I mean, we don't have to stop on my account. I can keep going." But Marcus was already guiding the wagon toward a grove of cottonwood trees where Willow Creek bent in a lazy curve. The sound of running water was too tempting to pass up, and the horses needed a drink anyway. He brought the wagon to a stop in the shade and climbed down, stretching his sore back. Catherine remained frozen on the wagon seat, her eyes wide and scared. Marcus realized she was afraid to be alone with him away from the road, where no one could hear her scream if she needed help. The thought made his heart ache for what she must have endured to be so terrified of a simple rest stop. "I'm going to water the horses," Marcus said carefully, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You can stay right there if you want, or you can stretch your legs by the creek. Whatever makes you comfortable." He unhitched the horses and led them to the water's edge, giving Catherine space to decide what she wanted to do. After a few minutes, he heard her climb down from the wagon. When he looked back, she was standing near the trees, still clutching her bundle but looking slightly less ready to run. The creek babbled peacefully over smooth rocks, and dragonflies danced above the water's surface. Marcus cupped his hands and drank deeply, then splashed the cold water on his face and neck. The simple pleasure of it reminded him that there were still good things in the world, even when everything seemed dark. "The water's clean here," he called to Catherine. "Help yourself." She approached the creek cautiously, like a wild deer coming to drink. When she knelt by the water's edge, Marcus saw her shoulders relax for the first time since he had met her. She drank carefully, then wet her hands and pressed them to her flushed cheeks. As they rested in the shade, Marcus pulled out a small sack of dried meat and hardtack from under the wagon seat. He offered some to Catherine, who accepted it with a quiet thank you. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the horses snort and stamp their feet in the creek. "Why did you buy me?" Catherine asked suddenly, her question cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a knife. Marcus chewed thoughtfully before answering. "I lost my wife 6 months ago," he said finally. "Been living alone ever since, and it's been hard. When I saw you sitting there with that sign around your neck, I guess I recognized something." "What did you recognize?" Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone who knows what it feels like when the world decides you're not worth much." Catherine was quiet for a long time, staring at the water flowing past their feet. When she spoke again, her words came out in a rush, like she was afraid she might lose her courage if she waited. "My husband sold me to pay off his gambling debts. The man who bought me." She stopped, swallowing hard. "He's dead now. That's why I was at the auction. His widow wanted me gone." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest like a red-hot flame, but he kept his voice gentle. "I'm sorry that happened to you. No one should have to go through that. People keep saying I'm damaged," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "Like I'm a broken piece of furniture that can't be fixed. Maybe they're right." "No," Marcus said firmly, turning to look at her directly. "You're not broken. You're hurt, and there's a difference. Broken things can't heal, but hurt things can get better with time and care." Catherine met his eyes for the first time since they had left town, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. Not trust, exactly, but maybe the first tiny seed of hope. As they prepared to continue their journey, Marcus noticed that Catherine sat a little straighter on the wagon seat. The fear was still there, probably would be for a long time, but it wasn't the only thing he saw in her face anymore. And for the first time in months, Marcus felt like he had done something that Sarah would have been proud of. Marcus's cabin appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage, its weathered wood walls and sagging front porch telling the story of a man who had stopped caring about appearances. Catherine studied the small homestead as their wagon rolled up the dirt path, taking in the overgrown vegetable garden, the chicken coop with its door hanging open, and the barn that leaned slightly to one side like an old man with a bad back. "It's not much to look at right now," Marcus admitted, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. "I haven't been keeping up with things lately." Catherine could see what the place had once been, a neat little farm with care put into every detail. The porch railing was carved with delicate flower patterns, and someone had planted roses along the front of the house, though they were now wild and thorny from neglect. It looked like a home where people had once been happy. Marcus helped her down from the wagon, and Catherine noticed how his touch was careful and brief, never lingering or making her feel trapped. Her bundle felt heavier in her arms as she followed him up the porch steps, the old boards creaking under their feet. The inside of the cabin was dim and cool after the blazing prairie sun. Catherine's eyes took a moment to adjust, and when they did, she saw a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and furniture covered in dust. But what caught her attention most were the little details that spoke of a woman's presence: embroidered curtains at the windows, a delicate china teapot on a shelf, and a rocking chair with a half-finished quilt draped over its arm. "That was Sarah's," Marcus said quietly, noticing where Catherine was looking. "My wife. She died of consumption last winter while I was away driving cattle to market." Catherine could hear the pain in his voice, raw and fresh as an open wound. She understood that kind of grief, the way it followed you around like a shadow, making everything feel empty and pointless. But she also understood that some people's grief made them kind, while others became cruel. She was still trying to figure out which kind Marcus was. "There's a small room back there," Marcus pointed toward a narrow door near the kitchen. "It's not much, but it has a window and a bed. You can have some privacy." Catherine set her bundle down and walked to the door he had indicated. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed and small wooden chest, but it was clean and the window looked out over a field of wildflowers. Most importantly, it had a latch on the inside of the door. "This is fine," she said, running her hand over the quilt that covered the bed. It was obviously handmade, stitched with the same careful attention as everything else in the house. Marcus nodded and turned away, giving her space to settle in. "I'll be outside unhitching the horses if you need anything. There's food in the kitchen, help yourself to whatever you want." As his footsteps faded away, Catherine sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. Through the thin walls, she could hear Marcus moving around outside, talking softly to his horses as he led them to the barn. The sounds were peaceful and ordinary, so different from the chaos and fear she had grown used to. Catherine opened her small bundle and spread her few possessions on the bed. A spare dress with patches on the sleeves, a comb with several broken teeth, a small Bible her mother had given her years ago, and hidden at the bottom, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, a kitchen knife with a blade sharp enough to protect herself if needed. She rewrapped the knife carefully and hid it under the mattress. Marcus seemed different from other men she had known, but Catherine had learned the hard way that people could change without warning. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, no matter how kind someone appeared to be. Later that evening, as the sun began to set behind the western hills, Catherine ventured into the main room where Marcus was trying to cook something over the fire. The smell of burning beans filled the cabin, and smoke was pouring from the pot in thick, black clouds. "Let me help," Catherine said without thinking, then immediately regretted speaking up. In her previous situation, offering help had sometimes been seen as criticism, and criticism led to punishment. But Marcus just stepped back with a sheepish grin. "I'd be grateful. I'm a better farmer than I am a cook, and that's not saying much lately." Catherine took over at the stove, salvaging what she could from the burnt beans and starting fresh with ingredients she found in the kitchen. As she worked, she became aware that Marcus was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to wait on me," he said suddenly. "I want you to know that. You're not here to be my servant." Catherine paused in her stirring, confused by his words. "Then why am I here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. I saw you at that auction and something inside me just reacted. Like when you see someone drowning and you jump in the water without thinking about whether you can swim. The comparison made Catherine smile slightly, the first real smile Marcus had seen from her. So we're both drowning? Maybe, Marcus said, but maybe we can help each other learn to float. As they ate dinner together at the small wooden table, Catherine found herself studying Marcus's face in the flickering candlelight. His features were strong but not harsh, and his eyes held a sadness that matched her own. She wondered what it would be like to trust someone again, to believe that not everyone wanted to hurt her. Can I ask you something? Catherine said as they finished eating. Marcus nodded, pushing his empty plate away. What happened to your wife? Really, you said consumption, but... She trailed off, not sure how to finish the question. Marcus's face grew dark, and for a moment Catherine thought she had pushed too far. But then he spoke, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. I was supposed to be home for the winter, but the cattle drive took longer than expected. Sarah got sick while I was gone, and by the time word reached me in Abilene, she'd already been dead for 2 weeks. He clenched his fists on the table. She died alone, Catherine. She called for me, and I wasn't there. Catherine reached across the table without thinking and covered one of his hands with hers. The gesture surprised them both, but neither pulled away. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. Sometimes terrible things just happen, no matter what we do to try to prevent them. Marcus looked down at their joined hands, and Catherine realized it was probably the first time he had been touched with kindness since his wife died. The thought made her heart ache for both of them, two people who had been hurt so badly that simple human contact felt like a miracle. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old cabin creak and sigh. But inside, by the warm glow of the fire, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. The possibility that she might be safe. A horse thundered up the dirt path at dawn, its hoofs pounding against the hard earth like gunshots that shattered the peaceful morning quiet. Catherine jerked awake in her small room, her heart hammering as she pressed herself against the wall and peered through the window curtain at the rider approaching Marcus's cabin. The man wore a dusty brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, but what made Catherine's blood turn to ice was the gleaming metal badge pinned to his chest. A lawman, here, looking for her. She could hear Marcus's heavy footsteps on the porch floorboards as he stepped outside to meet the unexpected visitor. Catherine crept to her door and pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear their conversation over the wild beating of her own heart. "Morning, Kane," the rider called out, his voice rough from too many years of shouting orders. "Name's Deputy Fletcher. I'm looking for a woman who might have passed through these parts recently." Marcus's reply was calm and steady, giving nothing away. "What kind of woman would that be, Deputy?" "Red-headed gal, about 20 years old. Goes by the name Catherine Walsh. She's wanted for questioning in connection with a man's death back east." Fletcher dismounted and tied his horse to the porch railing, his spurs jingling with each step. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Through the thin wall, Catherine could hear the creak of the porch boards as Marcus shifted his weight. She knew he was thinking carefully about his answer, weighing the consequences of lying to a law officer against the promise he had made to protect her. "Can't say that I do," Marcus said finally. "I keep to myself mostly. Don't get many visitors out here." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. He was lying for her. This man who barely knew her was risking his own freedom to keep her safe, and she couldn't understand why. In her experience, people only protected others when they had something to gain from it. Deputy Fletcher's boots clomped across the porch as he walked closer to the front door. "Mind if I take a look around? Won't take but a minute." "Actually, I do mind," Marcus replied, and Catherine could hear the steel in his voice now. "This is private property, and unless you've got a warrant, I'd appreciate if you'd state your business and move on." There was a long moment of silence, and Catherine imagined the two men staring at each other like wild animals deciding whether to fight or flee. Her hand moved instinctively to the knife hidden under her mattress, knowing that if the deputy found her, she would not go quietly. Funny thing, Fletcher said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. The auctioneer back in Clearwater remembers selling a red-headed woman to a man named Marcus Kane just 3 days ago. Paid $75 for her, which is a lot of money for damaged goods. Catherine's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a deep well. Of course someone had remembered the sale. There had been too many witnesses, too much attention drawn to the high price Marcus had paid. She had been foolish to think they could hide from the law forever. I bought some supplies in town, Marcus said carefully. Can't recall every person I might have seen while I was there. Is that so? Fletcher's spurs jingled again as he moved around the porch, probably trying to peek through the windows. Well, here's the thing, Kane. This Catherine Walsh is wanted in connection with the death of Silas Garrett, a respected businessman from Missouri. Seems Garrett bought her from her husband to work in his household, and a few weeks later, he turned up dead with his skull cracked open. Catherine closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the door. There it was, the truth she had been running from, laid out in all its ugly detail. She remembered that terrible night with perfect clarity. Garrett's hands grabbing at her in the dark kitchen, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her face. The sickening sound his head made when it hit the stone hearth after she pushed him away. That's a serious accusation, Marcus said, his voice giving away nothing of what he might be thinking. But I still don't see what it has to do with me. Fletcher laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Come now, Kane. We both know you've got her hidden somewhere on this property. Maybe in that barn or perhaps in the house itself. Why don't you save us both some trouble and hand her over? I promise she'll get a fair trial. Catherine knew what a fair trial meant for a woman who had killed a man, even in self-defense. She would hang, and everyone would say she deserved it for being ungrateful to her betters. The thought of the rope around her neck made her feel sick and dizzy. Even if I knew where this woman was, Marcus said slowly, I'd need to hear her side of the story before I'd turn her over to anyone. Seems to me a man's word carries a lot more weight than a woman's in these parts, especially when money's involved. The deputy's voice turned cold as winter wind. You're walking a dangerous line, Kane. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. Could get you 5 years in territorial prison, maybe more. And railroading an innocent woman could get you a lot worse, Marcus shot back. I've heard stories about Silas Garrett. Man had a reputation for taking liberties with women who couldn't fight back. Maybe someone finally gave him what he had coming. Catherine's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in months. Gratitude mixed with amazement that someone was willing to defend her, without even knowing the whole truth. Marcus was risking everything based on nothing more than his gut feeling that she was worth saving. Fletcher's boots stomped angrily across the porch. I'll be back, Kane, with a warrant and more men. And when I find that woman, I'll remember that you chose to protect a murderer over an officer of the law. You do what you think is right, deputy, Marcus replied calmly. And I'll do the same. Catherine heard the deputy mount his horse and ride away, but she remained frozen against her door for long minutes afterward. When Marcus finally knocked softly on her room, she could barely find her voice to answer. He's gone, Marcus said through the wood. But he'll be back, probably with help. We need to talk. Catherine opened the door with shaking hands and found Marcus standing in the hallway, his face grim but not angry. She had expected him to be furious with her for bringing danger to his home, for lying about who she really was. Instead, he looked like a man who had made up his mind about something important. You heard? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Enough, Marcus nodded. Want to tell me your version of what happened? So Catherine told him everything, about her husband's gambling debts, about being sold like a piece of property, about Garrett's drunken attack and the terrible accident that followed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently touched her shoulder, the same way he might comfort a frightened animal. I believe you, he said simply, and I'm not going to let them take you. Catherine stared at him in disbelief. Why? You barely know me. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Marcus smiled sadly. Maybe that's exactly what I needed. something to fight for besides my own grief. The early morning mist clung to the prairie grass like ghostly fingers as Marcus loaded supplies into his wagon, moving with the quick efficiency of a man who knew time was running out. Catherine stood in the cabin doorway, clutching the small bundle that contained everything she owned, watching him prepare for their escape with a mixture of hope and terror. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Marcus secured a water barrel in the wagon bed and checked the harness on his strongest horses. "I have a brother in New Mexico territory. Jake runs cattle near Santa Fe, far enough from Kansas jurisdiction that Deputy Fletcher can't touch you there." He paused and looked at her seriously. "But it's a hard journey, Catherine. 2 weeks across some rough country, and we'll have to avoid the main trails." Catherine nodded, understanding that he was giving her a choice. She could stay and face whatever justice awaited her, or trust this man who had already risked so much to keep her safe. The decision wasn't difficult. Staying meant certain death, while leaving offered at least a chance at freedom. As Marcus finished loading the wagon, Catherine took one last look around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for 3 precious days. Sarah's embroidered curtains still hung in the windows, and her rocking chair sat empty by the cold fireplace. Catherine felt a pang of sadness for the woman she had never met, whose husband was now abandoning their home to save a stranger. "Are you sure about this?" Catherine asked as Marcus helped her onto the wagon seat. "You're giving up everything for someone you barely know." Marcus climbed up beside her and took the reins in his weathered hands. "This place stopped being a home when Sarah died. It was just a place where I came to feel sorry for myself." He glanced back at the cabin one more time, then forward at the open prairie. "Maybe it's time to build something new." They set off toward the southwest, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from anyone trying to follow. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. For the first few hours, they traveled in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they were leaving behind and what lay ahead. Catherine found herself watching Marcus as he guided the horses, noting the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for signs of danger. He was protecting her with the same fierce determination she had seen in her father when he defended their farm from raiders during the war. Around midday, they stopped near a small grove of cottonwood trees to rest the horses and eat a quick meal. Catherine was surprised to discover that Marcus had packed enough supplies for weeks on the trail: blankets, dried meat, coffee, and even a small medicine bag in case of illness or injury. "You've been planning this," she realized as she watched him check their provisions. Marcus nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Since the moment I saw that deputy riding up to my cabin. I knew he'd be back with more men, and I knew I couldn't let them take you." He finally looked at her, his expression serious. "I won't lie to you, Catherine. This won't be easy. We'll be sleeping on the ground, dealing with bad weather, and staying ahead of anyone who might be following us." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Catherine replied firmly. "And I'm not afraid of sleeping under the stars. What scares me is the thought of going back to face a judge who's already decided I'm guilty." As they prepared to continue their journey, Marcus pulled a small leather pouch from his coat pocket and handed it to Catherine. "This is for you," he said, "in case something happens to me and you need to make it on your own." Catherine opened the pouch and gasped. Inside were 20 gold coins, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "Marcus, I can't take this. It's probably everything you have." "It's not everything," Marcus said with a slight smile. "But it's enough to give you a fresh start if you need it. Independence is worth more than gold, Catherine. My Sarah taught me that." As they climbed back onto the wagon and continued south, Catherine tucked the pouch safely inside her dress. The weight of the coins against her chest felt like a promise that no matter what happened, she would never again be completely at the mercy of others. The afternoon brought new challenges as they encountered their first real test of the journey. A group of riders appeared on the horizon behind them, moving fast and kicking up a dust cloud that could be seen for miles. Marcus urged their horses to a faster pace, but the wagon was too heavy to outrun mounted men. "Get down in the wagon bed," Marcus ordered, his voice tight with tension. "Cover yourself with that tarp and don't make a sound no matter what happens." Catherine scrambled into the back of the wagon and pulled the canvas over herself, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the riders would hear it when they got close. Through a small gap in the tarp, she could see Marcus sitting straight and calm on the driver's seat, but his hand rested on the rifle that lay across his knees. The riders caught up to them near a shallow creek crossing, surrounding the wagon with their horses snorting and stamping impatiently. Catherine held her breath and tried to make herself as small as possible under the heavy canvas. "Afternoon," called out the leader, a man with a gray beard and suspicious eyes. "You folks seem to be in a hurry." Marcus kept his voice steady and friendly. "Just trying to make good time before the weather turns. You never know when a storm might blow up out here." "That's true enough," the bearded man agreed, but his eyes were scanning the wagon contents. "You traveling alone?" "Just me and my supplies," Marcus replied easily. "Heading down to trade with the settlements near the Arkansas River." Catherine's lungs burned as she held her breath, waiting to see if the men would believe Marcus's story or demand to search the wagon. Everything depended on how convincing he could be, and whether these men were just curious travelers or something more dangerous. The bearded man nudged his horse closer to the wagon. "Funny thing, we heard there might be a fugitive in these parts. Woman wanted for murder. You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone like that, would you?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Can't say that I have. Though I'd be mighty careful about believing everything you hear. Folks out here love to spread stories, and they tend to get bigger with each telling." After what felt like an eternity, the bearded man wheeled his horse around and signaled to his companions. "Well, if you do see anything suspicious, you be sure to report it to the authorities. There's a reward for information leading to this woman's capture." As the riders galloped away toward the north, Catherine finally allowed herself to breathe again. Marcus waited until they were completely out of sight before he spoke. "You can come out now," he said softly. "They're gone." Catherine emerged from under the tarp, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Do you think they believed you?" Marcus was already urging the horses forward again, eager to put more distance between them and potential trouble. "For now. But word's spreading fast about the reward. We need to be more careful from here on out." As the sun began to set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Catherine realized that her old life was truly behind her now. There was no going back to the safety of Marcus's cabin, no pretending that she was just a woman seeking refuge from a hard world. She was a fugitive now, completely dependent on the kindness and courage of a man who had chosen to risk everything for her freedom. But for the first time since Garrett's death, Catherine felt something besides fear and despair. Sitting beside Marcus as their wagon rolled across the endless prairie, she felt the first stirrings of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life somewhere beyond the reach of those who wanted to see her hang. Lightning split the black sky like a jagged knife, followed by thunder that shook the earth beneath their wagon wheels as Marcus and Catherine raced across the open prairie toward the only shelter they could see, a crumbling adobe trading post that had been abandoned years ago. Rain poured down in sheets so thick they could barely see their horses' heads, and the wagon wheels slipped and slid in the rapidly forming mud. "There!" Marcus shouted over the roar of the storm, pointing toward the low building that squatted against the horizon like a wounded animal. "We can wait it out inside." Catherine clutched the wagon seat with both hands as they bounced and lurched across the uneven ground, her clothes already soaked through despite the canvas tarp Marcus had thrown over them. The storm had come from nowhere, building from a few dark clouds into a full fury in less than an hour, and now they were trapped in the middle of nowhere with lightning crackling all around them. Marcus drove the horses hard toward the trading post, knowing that being caught in the open during a prairie storm was one of the most dangerous situations a traveler could face. The building looked deserted, its windows dark and its wooden door hanging crooked on rusty hinges, but it would provide protection from the worst of the weather. They reached the shelter just as a particularly violent gust of wind nearly toppled the wagon. Marcus jumped down and fought against the storm to unhitch the horses, leading them toward what remained of a lean-to attached to the side of the building. Catherine grabbed their most essential supplies and ran for the door, stumbling through ankle-deep mud that tried to suck her boots right off her feet. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old leather and tobacco. Catherine's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through broken shutters, revealing a single large room with a stone fireplace, some overturned furniture, and shelves that had once held goods for travelers heading west. In one corner, a ladder led to a small loft where someone might have slept. Marcus burst through the door a few minutes later, dripping wet and breathing hard from fighting the wind. "Horses are secured," he panted, pushing the door closed against the storm. "This might last all night." As if to prove his point, another crash of thunder shook the building so hard that dust rained down from the wooden beams overhead. Catherine jumped at the sound, then felt foolish for being afraid of weather when they had much bigger problems to worry about. "At least we're dry," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Marcus was already moving around the room, checking for dangers they might not be able to see in the poor light. "There's still some firewood by the hearth," he observed, kneeling to examine the stone chimney. "And the roof seems solid enough, though I can hear water dripping somewhere in the back." As Marcus worked to start a fire, Catherine explored their temporary shelter more carefully. The trading post told the story of the frontier in scattered remnants. A broken coffee pot, some rusted horseshoes, and faded newspapers from towns she had never heard of. But what caught her attention was a small leather journal wedged behind one of the fallen shelves. She pulled it free and opened it carefully, revealing pages of handwriting in faded ink. The entries were dated from several years earlier, written by someone named Samuel Hutchins who had run the trading post before abandoning it to creditors. As Catherine read by the growing firelight, she discovered that Hutchins had faced many of the same problems they were dealing with: pursuit by the law, the need to disappear, and the constant fear of being caught. "Listen to this," Catherine called to Marcus, reading from the journal. "June 15th, 1864. The marshals came again today looking for me. Had to hide in the root cellar for 3 hours while they searched the place. Starting to think I should head for California and take my chances with the gold fields." Marcus looked up from the fire he was building. "What happened to him?" Catherine flipped through more pages, looking for an answer. "Here, August 3rd, 1864. Decided to stop running and face what's coming. A man can't live like a rabbit forever, always jumping at shadows. If they want me, they can find me here." "And did they?" Marcus asked, settling beside her on an old blanket they had spread near the fire. Catherine shook her head. "The entries stop after that. Either he left or—" She didn't finish the thought, but they both understood what probably happened to Samuel Hutchins. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the trading post, the fire created a circle of warmth and light that felt almost cozy. Marcus pulled some dried meat from their supplies, and Catherine found a dented pot that could hold water for coffee. As they shared their simple meal, the journal lay open between them like a warning about what could happen to people who ran too long from their past. "Do you think he was right?" Catherine asked quietly, staring into the flickering flames. "About not being able to live like a rabbit forever?" Marcus chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Depends on what you're running from, I suppose. Some things are worth facing, and others." He paused, looking at her with concern. "What are you thinking, Catherine?" "I'm thinking that maybe I'm tired of being afraid all the time," she admitted. "Every sound makes me jump. Every stranger could be someone looking for the reward money. What kind of life is that?" "It's the kind of life that keeps you breathing," Marcus replied firmly. "And as long as you're breathing, there's hope things can get better." Catherine picked up the journal again and read more of Samuel Hutchins' words. "He wrote something else here. The worst part isn't the fear of being caught. It's forgetting who you used to be before you became someone who had to run." The words hit both of them hard, because they recognized the truth in them. Marcus had been running from his grief and guilt over Sarah's death, while Catherine had been running from the consequences of defending herself against a man who would have destroyed her. Both of them had lost pieces of themselves in the process. As the night wore on and the storm gradually weakened, they took turns keeping watch while the other slept. Catherine found herself thinking about the choices ahead of them. They could keep running toward New Mexico territory and hope to disappear into the wilderness, or they could find another way to face the people hunting her. When Marcus woke near dawn to take his turn at watch, he found Catherine sitting by the dying fire with the journal in her lap, staring at the wall as if she could see through it to some distant future. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. "I was thinking about what Samuel wrote," Catherine replied. "About forgetting who you used to be. I don't want to forget, Marcus. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being afraid to use my real name or tell the truth about what happened." Marcus sat beside her and added another piece of wood to the fire. "What are you saying?" Catherine closed the journal and looked at him with determination in her storm-gray eyes. "I'm saying maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back." The sound of approaching horses woke them both at the same time, the steady thudding of hooves on wet ground cutting through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. Catherine's eyes flew open and met Marcus's across their makeshift camp, both of them instantly alert and ready for danger. Marcus crept to the broken window and peered through a gap in the shutters, his face grim as he counted the riders approaching the trading post. "4 men," he whispered back to Catherine, "and one of them is wearing a badge." Catherine felt her stomach drop like a stone, but instead of the paralyzing fear she had felt before, something else rose in her chest, a cold anger that steadied her hands and cleared her mind. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, and tired of letting other people decide her fate. "What do we do?" she asked, moving to gather their scattered supplies. Marcus checked his rifle and revolver, making sure both were loaded and ready. "The back wall has some loose boards," he said quietly. "I noticed them last night. You could slip out that way and run for the horses while I keep them busy." "No," Catherine said firmly, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "I'm done running, Marcus. Whatever happens here, we face it together." Before Marcus could argue, a voice called out from outside the trading post. "We know you're in there, Kane. Come out with your hands visible and bring the woman with you." Marcus recognized the voice. Deputy Fletcher had returned as promised, and this time he had brought help. Through the window, Marcus could see 3 other men spread out around the building, all armed and ready for trouble. "What do you want, Fletcher?" Marcus called back, stalling for time while he tried to think of a way out of their situation. "I want Catherine Walsh," Fletcher replied. "Hand her over peaceful-like, and nobody has to get hurt. But I'm not leaving here without her." Catherine moved to stand beside Marcus at the window, her chin raised defiantly. "He's not going to give up," she said quietly. "And I'm not going to let you get killed trying to protect me. Don't even think about surrendering," Marcus warned her. "You know what they'll do to you." "Maybe," Catherine agreed, "but maybe not. You said yourself that people are starting to talk about Silas Garrett's reputation with women. Maybe it's time someone told the truth about what really happened that night." Before Marcus could stop her, Catherine stepped toward the door. But instead of opening it, she called out in a clear, strong voice that carried across the morning air. "Deputy Fletcher, I'm Catherine Walsh, and I want to make a deal with you." There was a moment of surprised silence from outside. Then Fletcher's voice came back, cautious but interested. "What kind of deal?" "I'll come with you without a fight," Catherine called out. "But in return, I want safe passage to the nearest territorial judge and a promise that Marcus Kane will not be charged with any crime for helping me." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Catherine, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done weeks ago," she replied, then raised her voice again. "And I want the right to tell my side of the story before any sentence is passed." Fletcher's laugh was harsh and skeptical. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, lady." "Maybe not," Catherine admitted, "but I'm the only one who knows exactly what Silas Garrett did to me and the other women he bought. I'm also the only one who can tell you where he hid the money he made from selling women to men who wanted to abuse them." This time the silence from outside lasted much longer. Catherine was taking a huge gamble, claiming to know things she had only guessed at, but she had nothing left to lose. Garrett had been involved in something much worse than just buying one woman for his own twisted purposes. She was sure of it now. "You're lying," Fletcher called out finally, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Am I? Catherine shouted back. Then explain why Garrett paid my husband 3 times what I was worth at auction. Explain why he had a locked room in his house that his wife was never allowed to enter. Explain why there were other women's clothes hidden in his barn. Marcus looked at Catherine with new understanding. She had been in Garrett's house for weeks before the night he died, and she had obviously seen more than she had told him. She was using that knowledge now as a weapon, and it seemed to be working. Fletcher's voice came back after another long pause, but now it carried the tone of a man who was starting to doubt what he had been told. Even if that's true, you still killed him. I defended myself against a man who was trying to rape me, Catherine replied without hesitation. And if you take me back alive to tell that story in court, you might just discover that Silas Garrett wasn't the respected businessman everyone thought he was. From their position at the window, Marcus and Catherine could see the 4 men talking among themselves, clearly unsure how to proceed. Fletcher had obviously been expecting to capture a desperate fugitive, not deal with a woman who seemed eager to face her accusers. Finally, Fletcher called out again. You come out with your hands where we can see them, and we'll talk about your proposal. Catherine looked at Marcus one last time, her gray eyes soft with affection and gratitude. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. This isn't over, Marcus told her fiercely. I'll find a way to help you, Catherine. I promise. I know, she replied, then surprised him by rising on her toes to kiss his cheek gently. But for the first time in months, I'm not afraid. I know who I am, and I know what I did was right. Catherine walked to the door of the trading post and opened it slowly, stepping out into the morning sunlight with her hands raised but her head held high. She looked nothing like the broken woman who had sat on that auction platform just days earlier. Instead, she looked like someone who had found her courage and was ready to use it. As the deputies moved forward to place her in custody, Catherine called out one more thing that made Fletcher pause. Deputy, you might want to send a telegram to the territorial marshal's office. Ask them to look into the disappearances of women in Missouri over the past 2 years. I think you'll find that Silas Garrett's death solved more crimes than it created. Marcus watched from the window as they rode away with Catherine, his heart breaking but also swelling with pride. She had transformed herself from victim to fighter in the space of a few minutes, turning her capture into a chance to expose the truth about the man who had tried to destroy her. But as the dust from their departure settled over the abandoned trading post, Marcus made a decision of his own. Catherine might be ready to face her past, but he wasn't ready to let her face it alone. He had his own fighting to do, and it was time to stop being just a grieving widower and start being the kind of man Sarah would have been proud of. The chase was far from over, it was just beginning. The courthouse in Independence, Missouri stood like a fortress of red brick and white columns, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun as crowds gathered on the front steps to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Catherine Walsh sat in the defendant's chair, her back straight and her hands folded calmly in her lap, looking nothing like the terrified woman who had been dragged from that trading post 3 weeks earlier. Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man with silver hair and eyes like winter frost, banged his gavel to bring the packed courtroom to order. This court is now in session, he announced in a voice that could cut through steel. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Catherine Walsh in the death of Silas Garrett. The prosecutor, a thin man named William Cromwell who wore his ambition like an expensive suit, rose from his table with a confident smile. He had built his reputation on sending criminals to the gallows, and he clearly expected this case to be no different. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Cromwell began, his voice smooth as honey but with poison underneath. The facts of this case are simple. The defendant, Catherine Walsh, murdered Silas Garrett in cold blood, then fled like the guilty criminal she is. Catherine watched the 12 men in the jury box as Cromwell painted her as a dangerous killer who had turned on her generous benefactor. Half of them wouldn't meet her eyes, already convinced of her guilt before hearing a single piece of evidence. The other half looked curious but skeptical, as if they were willing to listen but expected to be disappointed. But Catherine wasn't alone in that courtroom. In the third row, she could see Marcus Kane sitting beside a man she didn't recognize. someone with kind eyes and a determined expression who kept taking notes in a small leather book. Marcus had kept his promise to help her, though she didn't yet understand how. When Cromwell finished his opening statement, Judge Blackwood turned to the defense table where a surprise waited for everyone in the courtroom. Catherine's lawyer wasn't the young, inexperienced attorney she had expected the court to assign her. Instead, a woman rose from the chair beside Catherine, a tall, elegant lady with graying hair and sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. "Your Honor," the woman said in a clear, confident voice, "I am Elizabeth Morrison, attorney at law, and I represent Miss Walsh." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. Female lawyers were rare as hen's teeth in Missouri, and seeing one defend a murder case was almost unheard of. Several men in the audience actually stood up to get a better look, as if Elizabeth Morrison was some kind of exotic circus performer. Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. Elizabeth Morrison was known throughout the territory as a brilliant legal mind who specialized in cases involving women's rights, and her presence here meant someone with serious money and influence was backing Catherine's defense. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room, "you have just heard Mr. Cromwell describe a simple case of murder, but I promise you that before this trial is over, you will learn that nothing about Silas Garrett's death was simple." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You will hear evidence that Silas Garrett was not the respected businessman the prosecution wants you to believe. Instead, he was a predator who bought and sold women like cattle, using them for his own twisted pleasures before disposing of them when he grew tired of their suffering." Cromwell shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "Objection! The victim is not on trial here." "Overruled," Judge Blackwood said quietly. "The jury will hear all relevant evidence about the circumstances surrounding Mr. Garrett's death." Catherine felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower after rain. Someone was finally going to tell the truth about what Silas Garrett really was, and people were going to listen whether they wanted to or not. Morrison walked to the center of the courtroom, commanding attention like a general addressing her troops. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Catherine Walsh is a killer, but the evidence will show that she is actually a survivor, a young woman who fought back against a monster when no one else would help her." As Morrison outlined her defense strategy, Catherine noticed movement in the gallery. Deputy Fletcher was whispering urgently to someone in an expensive suit, probably one of Garrett's business associates who had come to see justice served. But their expressions weren't confident anymore. They looked worried, like men who were beginning to realize their secrets might not stay buried. The first witness Cromwell called was Mrs. Helen Garrett, the victim's widow. She took the stand wearing black mourning clothes and a veil that couldn't quite hide the bruises on her wrists. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet the judge had to ask her twice to speak up. "My husband was a good man," she said, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. "He provided well for our family and was respected in the community." But when Morrison cross-examined her, cracks began to appear in the perfect picture of Silas Garrett that the prosecution was trying to paint. "Mrs. Garrett," Morrison said gently, "did your husband often bring women to work in your household?" "Sometimes," Helen Garrett replied nervously, "when we needed extra help." "And how many of these women would you say passed through your home over the past 2 years?" Helen's hands twisted in her lap. I don't remember exactly." "Would it surprise you to learn that your neighbors counted at least 15 different women working in your house during that time period?" Morrison asked. "And that most of them stayed only a few weeks before disappearing completely?" Cromwell objected again, but Judge Blackwood allowed the question. Helen Garrett's face went pale, and when she answered, her voice was barely audible. "My husband said they were unreliable workers who left without notice." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Garrett, did you ever wonder why your husband kept that locked room on the second floor that you were forbidden to enter?" The question hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Helen Garrett gasped and looked around desperately, as if seeking help from someone in the audience. When she spoke again, her voice cracked with emotion. He said it was his private study, that he needed a place to conduct business without interruption. And you never questioned why he was the only one with a key to that room? Morrison pressed. Or why you sometimes heard crying coming from inside late at night? Helen Garrett broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands as the truth she had tried so hard to ignore came pouring out. I knew, she whispered. God forgive me. I knew something terrible was happening, but I was too afraid to stop it. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and angry shouts. Judge Blackwood pounded his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the room if order wasn't restored. But the damage was done. The perfect image of Silas Garrett had cracked wide open, revealing the monster underneath. As court adjourned for the day, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that truth might actually triumph over lies. Elizabeth Morrison had kept her promise to expose Garrett's crimes, and the jury was beginning to see that Catherine wasn't a murderer but a victim who had finally found the courage to fight back. But Catherine also noticed that some of the men in expensive suits were leaving the courtroom with grim expressions, talking quietly among themselves. Silas Garrett's death wasn't just about one woman defending herself. It was about exposing a network of corruption that reached much higher than anyone had imagined. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus Kane stood in the shadows outside the boarding house where Catherine was being held under guard, his heart pounding as he watched two deputy marshals patrol the street like hunting wolves. The trial had been going better than anyone expected, but Marcus knew that powerful men were growing desperate, and desperate men did dangerous things. Inside the boarding house, Catherine sat by her small window reading a letter that had arrived that morning. The third death threat she had received since Elizabeth Morrison began exposing the truth about Silas Garrett's criminal network. The letters all said the same thing. Drop the self-defense claim and accept a charge of manslaughter, or face consequences that would be far worse than hanging. But Catherine had made her choice weeks ago when she decided to stop running. She folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in her Bible, evidence that someone was trying to intimidate her into silence. Morrison had told her that fear was their enemy's greatest weapon, and Catherine refused to give them that victory. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. One of the guards opened it to admit a visitor that made Catherine's eyes widen in surprise, Mrs. Helen Garrett, still dressed in black but looking somehow lighter than she had in the courtroom. May I speak with Miss Walsh privately? Helen asked the guard. Just for a few minutes. The deputy looked uncertain, but Helen Garrett was still technically the victim's widow, so he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Helen moved to the chair across from Catherine, her hands shaking as she sat down. I came to apologize, Helen said without preamble, and to tell you something that might help your case. Catherine studied the older woman's face, seeing guilt and pain etched in every line. You don't owe me an apology, Mrs. Garrett. You were as much his victim as I was. No. Helen shook her head firmly. I was worse than a victim. I was a coward who let innocent women suffer because I was too afraid to speak up. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small brass key. This opens the locked room in my house. Your lawyer needs to see what's inside. Catherine took the key, feeling its weight like a promise of justice. What will she find? Helen's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she was afraid someone might overhear. Papers, records of sales and purchases, names of other men who bought women from my husband. She paused, tears streaming down her cheeks. And photographs, terrible photographs that prove what he did to them. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. Silas Garrett hadn't just been a man who abused the women he bought. He had been running an entire operation, selling women to other predators and documenting their suffering. Her killing him had done more than save her own life. It had ended a network of horror that had destroyed dozens of innocent women. Why are you telling me this now? Catherine asked. Because I heard about the death threats, Helen replied. And because I know the men who sent them. They were my husband's business partners, and they're terrified that their names are in those records. She leaned forward urgently. They won't stop with threats, Miss Walsh. If the trial keeps going the way it has, they'll try to kill you before you can testify. As if summoned by her words, the sound of breaking glass came from the street below. Catherine and Helen rushed to the window and saw Marcus Kane fighting with two men in the alley behind the boarding house. while a third man climbed through a broken window on the first floor. "They're here," Helen gasped. "It's happening now." Catherine didn't hesitate. She grabbed the poker from beside the small fireplace and moved toward her door, but Helen caught her arm. "There's another way," Helen said quickly. "A back staircase that leads to the kitchen. I can show you." But Catherine shook her head. "I'm done hiding and running. If they want me, they'll have to fight for me." She opened her door and stepped into the hallway just as one of the intruders reached the top of the stairs. He was a big man with cold eyes and a gun in his hand, clearly expecting to find a helpless woman cowering in her room. Instead, he found Catherine Walsh standing in the doorway with an iron poker raised like a sword, her storm-gray eyes blazing with fury. "You made a mistake coming here," Catherine told him calmly. The man laughed and raised his gun. "Last mistake I'll ever make, girlie." But before he could pull the trigger, Marcus Kane appeared behind him, moving like a ghost through the shadows. The crash tackle sent both men tumbling down the stairs in a tangle of arms and legs, the gun spinning away across the wooden floor. More shouts and breaking furniture came from downstairs as the fight spread throughout the boarding house. Catherine could hear the guards yelling for backup and the sound of running feet in the street outside. But she also heard something else. Elizabeth Morrison's voice calling her name from the front entrance. "Catherine, we need to get you out of here." Catherine and Helen made their way carefully down the back staircase, avoiding the main fight but ready to defend themselves if necessary. They found Morrison waiting by the kitchen door with a carriage and two armed men who looked like they meant business. "Thank God you're safe," Morrison said as they climbed into the carriage. "We got word that Garrett's associates were planning something desperate." As they drove quickly through the darkening streets toward a safe house, Helen Garrett pressed the brass key into Morrison's hand. "Everything you need to convict them all is in that locked room," she said. "Letters, photographs, business records, proof of every crime they committed." Morrison's eyes lit up with the fierce joy of a hunter who had just found the perfect trap for her prey. "Mrs. Garrett, you may have just saved more lives than you can imagine." Behind them, the boarding house was surrounded by law enforcement officers who had arrived just in time to arrest the men who had tried to silence Catherine. Marcus Kane emerged from the building with a cut lip and torn shirt, but victorious in his fight to protect the woman he loved. As their carriage rolled through the night towards safety, Catherine felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more dangers to face, but something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for justice for all the women who had suffered at the hands of men like Silas Garrett. The scared, broken woman who had sat on that auction platform with a sign around her neck was gone forever. In her place sat Catherine Walsh, a woman who had found her strength and was ready to use it to change the world. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin in that courtroom. But tonight, surrounded by people who believed in her and supported her fight for justice, Catherine knew that no matter what happened, she had already won the most important victory of all. She had reclaimed herself.